Here are the scariest ways women were punished throughout ancient China. Which punishment disturbs you the most? Let us know below. Number 10. Foot binding. This is perhaps the most disturbing and well-known practice on this list. All the more dangerous because while today it would certainly be considered a punishment, at the time it was thought of as a standard. It was fully established in the Song dynasty, but likely began under the previous emperor Li Yu in the 10th century. In the legends, the emperor asks his favorite courtesan to bind her feet into a crescent moon and dance for him, which was reputedly the most graceful dance the emperor had ever seen, and the practice spread from there. It involves, beginning at 5 years old, cracking the 4 small toes and wrapping the toes underneath the feet, forcing them to grow in a twisted position, and then breaking the arch to allow the toes to be pulled backwards towards the heel. This continues for 3 to 4 years until the feet are permanently curved. This was a seriously dangerous practice, which in the best case scenario would lead to a lifetime of foot, joint, and back pain, so severe that walking was nearly prohibitive. In the worst case, the multiple fresh fractures would cause internal bleeding, followed by an infection of the blood, with sepsis setting in within weeks. Many girls died. Number 9. Tattooing. One of the 5 punishments meted out by the numerous ancient Chinese dynasties, tattooing the face was considered to be the most minor punishment of the 5 disfiguring punishments, and was used to punish women who were liars, overly promiscuous, overly talkative, or who did not adhere to the orders of their father, husband, or son. The concept of tattooing had for long been considered deeply disgraceful and a sin against one's ancestors, defiling the body they provided you, and so carried significant cultural weight, along with the fact that you would be permanently branded for life with your crime. Many women subject to this practice would have been humiliated out of public life, and if they had no husband, who would have been punished alongside her for failing to control her, would have had no options left but to go to a brothel or someplace worse. Women had very little autonomy, and so would have been punished alongside their primary caretaker, though usually he would be treated less severely given the case. In the case of S.A., the woman who was forced would be considered as guilty as the attacker, as she had allowed her father's, husband's, son's property to be sullied. She would often meet the same punishment as her attacker. Number 8. Yi. Yi was considered the next of the 5 disfiguring punishments, and involved another face-based disfigurement. This time, the entire nose was to be removed, without anesthetic, and usually in a very public place. This was a relatively common punishment for several centuries, and was meted out for hundreds of different offenses. Commonly used as a punishment for taking advantage of one's position, adultery, or cruelty, this judgment was often handed down on women for significantly less severe infractions. A woman whose child passed of illness and was deemed responsible may have this punishment. As well, if her husband, father, or son was of a higher station, and she was found guilty of abusing her proximity to power, regardless of if she necessarily did, she would also likely meet this punishment. There were cases of courtesans and concubines accusing other concubines of impropriety in order to have them suffer yi, allowing themselves to gain more power while humiliating her rival. The punishment was primarily used against people who the judiciary wanted the world to know had committed some shameful act. Removing the entire nose is a very drastic and disfiguring action, which would leave the person indelibly marked for life. Number 7. Yue. Yue is the 3rd most extreme of the 5 disfiguring punishments, and involves removing one or both feet. The oldest recorded Yue was from 3,000 years ago. A middle-aged woman's body was discovered with signs that she had lived without her feet after the Yue for quite some time and must have been cared for by someone. Each of these 5 punishments, except for the final, which is death and pretty self-explanatory, is designed to match the crime in a sense. Women seeking fame or power above their station would be met with yi, marring their beauty, or mo, the face tattooing. But women who sought to leave their father's, husband's, or son's control, or who had committed adultery or some other severely disobedient act, would be met with Yue. Not only showing to the world that she had broken the law and been severely disobedient, but also physically forcing her to be dependent on a man in her life, typically the very male figure she had been trying to escape from initially. Men would also be met with Yue, but typically for much more severe crimes in our modern eyes, than simply seeking autonomy or self-determination. It's important to remember that culturally, a woman seeking autonomy was considered equivalent to a man stealing cattle or an officer abandoning his post in severity. Number 6. Zhang. While not one of the initial 5 punishments, Zhang became one of them during the Han Dynasty as they moved away from such disfiguring practices. The practice involves the beating of the person's body with a stiff wooden cane, and the lowest number of beatings is 60 strikes, going up to 100. The Han Dynasty was more interested in legal processes beyond just a death sentence. But to an adult man, a sentence of 80 strikes is essentially a death sentence anyways. To the women who were sentenced to it, it was often a death sentence as well, as the bruised and lacerated skin would easily become infected, and the broken and bruised muscles would often cause blood poisoning. Trying to divorce her husband, bring charges against him or their controlling male figure, or any number of other attempts at independence or self-control would be met with this punishment. Sometimes the sentence was included with exile, 620, 770, or 930 miles away from their hometown. But they would also, regardless, be sentenced to 100 strikes, which was again many times a death sentence. Number 5. Grain pounding. While the 5 disfiguring punishments were some of the most well-known, there were crimes that were not considered worthy of disfigurement. For those crimes, the punishment would be hours, days, weeks, or years working in manual labor. For women, this manual labor was grain pounding, making the flour that would be distributed to armies and cities all across the empire. Men, on the other hand, for the same crimes, would be sentenced to wall building. Both jobs were draining and dangerous, with fingers, hands, arms, toes, feet, legs, and hair all at risk of being caught, torn, and ground to mulch by the heavy grinding stones. Many times, punishments could stack, and so a woman who had made some insult or injury to another while grinding grain could be sentenced to more of the same or to one of the 5 punishments. It was not unheard of for people to be falsely accused and sentenced to grain pounding just to support the army in times of war. Number 4. The wagon. This particularly vicious punishment was primarily used for one crime only: the crime of using a non-adult to commit murder. Say person A pays person B, an immature non-adult, to take the life of person C. Person A would be sentenced to the wagon, while person B would not be found guilty unless extenuating circumstances applied. What was the wagon? Well, the person who was found guilty would have loops of rope bind their shoulders, arms, and head to one ox wagon, while more rope would tie their hips and legs to another ox wagon. The wagons were then driven away from each other, the ropes tightened, and all manner of grisly things would begin popping, cracking, splitting, and tearing. This may sound, in essence, similar to medieval European quartering, but the main difference is that oxen do not have the same initial speed or horsepower as horses do. So while someone being quartered would be rent asunder in seconds, the wagon would take a significant amount of time, and the inherent flexibility of the rope and wooden carts would make the pain last significantly longer. Why is this a punishment for women, though, if anyone could be found guilty of it? Well, in most cases, the non-adult paid for the crime would be a family's own, and it was fairly easy in most court cases for the husband to put all blame and responsibility on his wife, who would have had little, if any, chance at fighting the charge after being accused by her husband. Number 3. Expectation. Much as today, the most pervasive punishments for women was simply the expectation of society. Especially during the imperial age, beauty standards and expectations of behavior were incredibly strict, humiliating, and degrading. They would change greatly with each emperor, which has led to some periods of ancient Chinese history seeing healthy and curvaceous women as most desirable. However, much more often, paleness and thinness were prized above all else. This led to many cases of an emperor's concubines starving themselves as thin as they could go, until they had no energy to even move or dance, and eventually passed of starvation. While these women did starve themselves to death, it was the toxic expectation of inhuman thinness and petiteness, backed by the word of a literal god on earth, that drove them to such extremes. Women would literally end themselves just for the chance to be seen as beautiful, one of the only positive qualities they were allowed to have. Thank God that doesn't happen to this day, right? Number 2. Gongxing. Gongxing was the 4th of the 5 disfiguring punishments, and the most severe punishment which could be delivered under the law of the 5 punishments aside from death. For men, gong involved the removal of all external sexual organs, making the men eunuchs. For women, gongxing was especially brutal, however. It's important to note the massive variety and breadth of methods the ancient Chinese judiciary had developed to enact gong. For men, there was cutting, smashing, crushing, snipping, trimming, chopping, and slicing methods, all for different crimes. For women, there were similarly horrific methods of castration. Stitching, cutting off of the sensitive parts, or branding were not uncommon. However, it seems the most common methods of gongxin were either internal mutilation, wherein so much internal damage was done with a blade that sterility was guaranteed, or external impact, beating so severe that they caused a uterine prolapse. These punishments were horrifically scarring, life-changing, and often a death sentence in its own right. Traditionally, this was done to adulterers. However, a woman who was attacked and forced would often suffer this punishment along with her attacker. Number 1. Degradation. The most common punishment for women throughout history is that of emotional or status degradation. Public humiliations in the form of public beatings, lashings, parading the woman around in disarray to be mocked and objectified, or having an official statement as to her failings read in the public square were commonplace tools used to keep women in line. However, it is the status degradation that is perhaps the most obviously and directly harmful. As women gained more powerful in the few ways they could, mostly by being a concubine to some powerful male figure, the risk of status degradation became ever higher, with women in the emperor's harem often cheating and backstabbing one another to get ahead, as this was often their only political route to any sort of power. However, status degradation could be so shameful that the women it was done to would simply take their lives outright, rather than suffer through the coming hell. Women had no autonomy and had to be owned to have much of any rights. A noblewoman who was degraded to a commoner would likely lose her husband as well, as he had multiple wives and didn't need her shame. And so she would be left with essentially no options but to sell herself, find someone to take care of her, or end her life. Those were the scariest ways women were punished throughout ancient China. If you enjoyed, please like, comment, and share, and be sure to follow for more.